The day Theresa Fletcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, her wagon wheel broke clean off on the main street, and every man who watched her climb down from that splintered seat figured she'd be on the next eastbound stage before the week was out. It was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything, the last real town before the cattle trails bit into Indian territory, a place where cowboys came to spend their wages and gamblers came to take them, where the wind off the prairie smelled of sage and dust, and a particular kind of longing that had no proper name. The town was rough in the way that all border towns were rough, with a rawness to its timber buildings and a wariness in the eyes of its people, as though everyone knew the civilized world stopped about 50 yards past the last saloon. Theresa was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a practical bonnet, green eyes that missed very little, and hands already calloused from a year of homesteading 100 miles east on a quarter section. She'd claimed after her husband Robert had died of a fever 18 months prior. She had sold that land not because she couldn't work it, she absolutely could, but because she had decided that grief was a thing best outrun, and the only direction that made sense was west. She had $40, a milk cow tied to the back of the wagon, a trunk of tools, seeds, and books, and enough stubbornness to make the devil himself step aside. The wheel had come off with a sound like a gunshot, and the right front corner of her wagon had dropped hard into the rutted street. The milk cow bayed her displeasure. Theresa stood in the June heat, assessed the damage with her arms crossed over her chest, and said, quietly but with considerable feeling, "Well, damnation." "You need a hand with that, ma'am." She turned around. The man standing behind her was leaning against the post of the feed store with his arms folded, watching her the way a person watches a fire, not sure yet if it's going to warm you or burn you. He was somewhere around 30, she guessed, maybe a year or two over. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of lean and weathered build that came from years of outdoor work. His hair was dark and needed cutting, his jaw carried several days of stubble, and his eyes were the color of a sky just after a storm has passed gray-blue and unsettled, clear and careful at the same time. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, trail-dusty boots, and a battered hat that had clearly seen 100 miles of hard use. There was a star-shaped badge on his vest. The sheriff's badge, she would realize, was pinned just slightly crooked, as though it had been put there without much ceremony. "I might," Theresa said, because she was honest even when honesty was inconvenient. He pushed off the post and walked over and crouched down to look at the wheel, and she noticed that he moved with the careful, deliberate economy of a man who had learned at some point not to make sudden movements. He turned the broken spoke in his fingers and looked at the axle and said nothing for a moment. "Axle's fine. Wheel's done, though." He stood up and looked at her wagon. "You got anything in here that can't stand some jostling?" "Seeds, tools, books, and a set of my mother's china that I probably should have left behind 3 states ago," she said. Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't fully commit to being one. "I'll send the boy from the livery to bring a cart. We'll get your things to the boarding house and have Harkins look at the wheel. He can fix it, given a day or two." "Thank you," she said, and put out her hand the way she'd seen men do it, direct and unambiguous. "Theresa Fletcher." He looked at her hand for just a moment as if he hadn't expected it, then shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "Abel Sullivan, I'm the law here, such as it is." "How long has it been such as it is?" she asked. That not-quite smile crossed his face again. "About 3 years." She would learn over the days that followed what those 3 years had contained. Caldwell had a boarding house run by a widow named Margaret Sims, who was approximately 60 years old, had opinions about everything, and kept the finest kitchen in the county as a way of compensating for the general disorder of the world around her. Margaret gave Theresa the room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that looked out over the back garden, and told her that breakfast was at 7, supper at 6, and if she came in late she'd find the door locked and a cold plate on the porch. "Most women who come through here alone are either running from something or looking for something," Margaret said, setting down a pitcher of water on the washstand with the authority of a woman who has made this speech before. "Both, I suppose," Theresa said. Margaret looked at her with a reassessing sort of attention. "Honest, that's rarer than you'd think." She paused at the door. "You met Abel Sullivan when you came in. He helped with my wagon. He does that, helps people." Margaret's voice went careful and considered. "He's a good man, Theresa. Whatever else you hear about him while you're here, remember that first." It was an odd thing to say, and Theresa thought about it while she unpacked her trunk, arranging her mother's china on the shelf above the washstand with the kind of ceremony that small routines become when you're trying to build a life from scratch. She found out the next morning what Margaret had meant, and not from Margaret. Caldwell had a general store run by a man named Holt, who had the particular gift of knowing everyone's business while pretending only to know the weather and the price of flour. She went in to buy provisions and ended up hearing, in the roundabout way of small towns, the broad outline of Abel Sullivan's history. He had ridden with the Union Army during the war. He would have been quite young, barely 18 when it ended, which put the worst of it squarely in the years when a boy becomes a man. After the war, he'd spent several years doing what a lot of men did who came back from that particular darkness: drifting, working cattle drives, taking jobs that kept him moving and left him too tired to dream. He'd been a deputy in Wichita for a year before coming to Caldwell, where the town council had offered him the sheriff's position after the previous sheriff had decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and ridden east one quiet Thursday morning without leaving a forwarding address. What Holt mentioned only obliquely, and what Theresa pieced together from other sources over the following days, was that Abel Sullivan had ridden into Caldwell 3 years ago carrying not just his personal history, but the weight of something specific. A skirmish on a cattle drive 2 years before that had gone terribly wrong, in which he had been one of 3 survivors out of a crew of 11, and in which he had done what he'd had to do to survive, and in which the things he'd seen and done had settled into him like iron filings in water, invisible but changing everything about how he moved through the world. He was not unfriendly. He was courteous, reliable, effective at his job, and present at every community event in the way that a man who takes responsibility seriously is present. He kept the peace in a town that required constant keeping. He broke up fights, managed the cowboys who came in off the trail, maintained a careful diplomacy with the various factions that made up Caldwell's complicated social landscape, and was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of man you wanted holding the law in a border town. What he was not, and had apparently made clear to the several women who had, over 3 years, expressed interest, was available, not in that particular way, not for that particular thing. "He's polite about it," the woman at the millinery shop told Theresa, with the slightly resigned air of someone who had received one of those polite refusals herself. "He'll say he's not the marrying kind, or that he's too occupied with his work, but if you watch him long enough you see it's something else. Something he's keeping very locked up." Theresa had listened to all of this without comment, because she was new here and it was not her business, and because she had not come to Caldwell looking for a husband. She had come to find land, file a claim, and build something that belonged to her. That was the plan, and she intended to keep to it. The plan survived until approximately Thursday. She was at the land office that Thursday morning, talking to the clerk about available quarter sections within a reasonable distance of Caldwell, when Abel Sullivan came in. He wasn't there about land. He was there about a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights, which was, she was learning, an ongoing and deeply personal conflict in this part of Kansas. He handled the dispute with the kind of quiet, firm authority that is more effective than any raised voice, and she found herself watching him without quite meaning to, the way you watch a person who is very good at something difficult and make it look effortless. He caught her watching when the ranchers had gone and the clerk had retreated to his files. She didn't look away because she was not someone who looked away from things. "You find what you were looking for?" he asked. "There are 2 good sections about 12 miles northwest," she said. "Decent water access from Bluff Creek, the clerk says. I'm going to ride out and look at them tomorrow." He studied her for a moment with those careful storm-colored eyes. "Alone?" "I rode here from Osage County alone," she said pleasantly. "That's a different kind of country," he said. "Northwest of here is closer to the territory line. There are cattle drives coming through and the trail gets complicated." "Are you offering to come with me, Sheriff Sullivan?" she asked, and she kept her voice light and curious because she was genuinely curious. A pause, something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. "I know the land out that way. I've ridden it often enough." He adjusted his hat. "I have business in that direction tomorrow in any case." "That would be convenient," she said agreeably. He looked at her as though trying to determine whether she was making fun of him and finding the answer unclear. 7 in the morning, then, in front of the boarding house. She was there at 6:50, which she could tell pleased him in the way that punctuality pleases people who are themselves always precisely on time. They rode out of Caldwell as the sun was still low and gold against the prairie grass, which was full and green from a good spring, rippling in the early morning wind like water. He rode a solid dark bay gelding he called Cato, and she rode a hired gray mare from the livery. The land opened out around them in that vast, clean, uncomplicated way that the Kansas prairie has in the early morning, when the sky is enormous and the horizon seems to be personally offering you something, though it never specifies exactly what. He showed her the 2 sections and pointed out their respective advantages with a practical, knowledgeable thoroughness that suggested he'd been paying attention to the land around his town for 3 years in the same careful way he paid attention to everything else. The first section was flatter, better for crops, closer to a seasonal stream that might or might not be reliable. The second was slightly more irregular in terrain, harder to plow, but had a year-round spring and a stand of cottonwood trees along its eastern boundary, and a long view south toward the distant shimmer of Indian Territory. She stood on the small rise at the center of the second section for a long time without saying anything. "This one," she said finally. "Why?" he asked. He was genuinely asking. She turned to look at him. "Because it's harder. The hard ones are the ones worth keeping." She paused. "And because of those cottonwoods. My mother had cottonwoods outside the kitchen window in Ohio. The sound they make in the wind is like something you can't quite remember but almost can." He was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at him, she found him looking at the cottonwoods with an expression she recognized, not because she'd seen it on his face before, but because she'd seen it in mirrors. That particular kind of private, aching tenderness for things that have been lost. "She's gone?" he asked. 12 years ago," she said. "Fever." He nodded slowly, the way people do when they understand the particular mathematics of loss. They ate their midday meal on the grass near the spring. She'd brought biscuits and dried beef from Margaret's kitchen, and he'd brought coffee in a tin pot he heated over a quick fire with the practiced ease of a man who has cooked outdoors, so often that a campfire is as natural as a hearth. They sat with several feet of proper distance between them and talked about the land and about Caldwell, and then, because she had a gift for asking questions that were direct without being aggressive, about him. "How long did you ride before you settled here?" she asked. He turned his tin cup in his hands. 7 years, more or less. "That's a long time to be moving." "It is." "What made you stop?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then I wasn't sure I was going to stop. The town needed someone and the job was there and I was tired." He paused, tired enough that stopping seemed survivable. She noticed the word he'd chosen, not desirable, not appealing, survivable, as if the question of what he wanted had long since been replaced by the simpler question of what he could endure. "You make it sound like a medical decision," she said. Maybe it was. He looked out over the prairie. "Some things in a man's life are medical decisions." She did not press. She was not a woman who pressed, but she filed the remark away with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered, especially when she didn't fully understand them yet. They rode back to Caldwell in the late afternoon, with the sun behind them and their long shadows stretching out ahead across the golden grass. He talked more easily on the ride back, about the politics of the cattle drives, about the complicated relationship between Caldwell and the stockmen, about a family of sodbusters named Weaver who'd been on their land 6 miles north for 2 years and were, against all reasonable expectation, going to make it. He talked about the land with the same attention and care he gave to everything, and she listened with genuine interest, because she had always believed that the way a person talked about a place told you most of what you needed to know about who they were. He left her at the boarding house gate with his hat in his hand in a gesture so old-fashioned and instinctive that she thought he probably didn't know he'd done it. "Thank you," she said, "for the land assessment and the company both." It was no trouble, he said, which was either true or polite, and she couldn't be certain which. She filed her claim the following Monday. The land was hers for the filing fee and the promise of 5 years of residence and improvement. She stood outside the land office in the June sunshine and felt the particular, anchoring satisfaction of a woman who has done what she set out to do. She had a piece of the earth now. What she needed was the means to build something on it. The practical reality of homesteading alone in 1878 Kansas was this: the land was yours, but the labor was relentless, and the first year was the hardest. Theresa had the tools and the knowledge. Her father had been a farmer, and she had grown up watching the making of a working homestead from the ground up. She knew how to break sod and plant and harvest and preserve. She knew how to keep livestock and mend fence and manage a water supply. What she lacked was help with the heaviest initial work: the well digging, the structure building, the breaking of the first stubborn acres of prairie sod. She hired 2 young men from Caldwell, brothers named Pete and Lyle Gunderson, who were 17 and 19 respectively and strong as oxen, and she arranged with the local lumber merchant for delivery of materials. She moved out to her land in early July, setting up her canvas tent near the cottonwoods while the cabin went up, managing the construction with a combination of her own labor and directed instruction that left both Gunderson brothers slightly in awe of her and entirely willing to do what she told them. Abel Sullivan rode out twice in that first month. Both times he said he had business in the area, and both times she thought the business was at least partially checking on her, though she didn't say so because she found she didn't mind. The first time he came, he helped Pete Gunderson with the well casing, which was heavy work requiring exactly the kind of experienced judgment he had and Pete lacked. He stayed 3 hours, worked without being asked, and left before supper. The second time he came, the cabin was up and she was plastering the interior walls, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at what had been built: the sturdy single room with its loft, the fireplace she'd laid herself, the window facing south toward the cottonwoods, and there was something in his face that was more than the ordinary appreciation of good workmanship. "You did this in 3 weeks," he said. "The Gundersons did most of the heavy lifting," she said, meaning it but also not entirely meaning it. He looked at her with a directness that was unusual for him, his careful reserve laid aside for just a moment. "I've seen men with twice the help take twice the time and end up with half the result," he said. "This is good work, Mrs. Fletcher." She noticed he'd gone back to using the formal address. She'd asked him, on the ride out to look at the land, to call her Theresa, and he had, but now he was retreating to the careful distance of titles, and she noticed it and chose not to remark on it. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, with the smallest possible emphasis, and watched him notice it. Something moved through his eyes, awareness, and something that might have been rueful, and he settled his hat back on his head. "It's Abel," he said, as if conceding a point. "Thank you, Abel," she said pleasantly. He stayed for supper that evening. She had made beef stew with the dried beef from her stores and vegetables from the kitchen garden, She'd started at the eastern wall of the cabin, and she served it with the sourdough bread she'd been keeping a starter going for since Caldwell, because some things a person simply requires. He ate with the appetite of a man who spent most of his time eating quick trail food alone, and he asked her about her plans for the land, what she intended to plant, how she was thinking about the livestock situation, whether she planned to try wheat or stick to corn and kitchen garden until she was more established. They talked for 2 hours in the way that people talk when they have found, unexpectedly and without looking for it, someone who thinks in a register that matches their own. When he got up to go, it was nearly dark, and he stood for a moment at the door looking out at the prairie under the enormous Kansas twilight, the sky going from copper to rose to deep violet, the cottonwoods moving gently in the evening wind. There were fireflies beginning in the grass, which was a thing Theresa had always found nearly unbearably beautiful. "My mother would have liked this land," he said, and it was said so quietly and so simply that she understood it was not something he'd meant to say out loud. She did not say anything immediately because she had learned that sometimes the most important things a person says require silence in return, at least briefly. "Tell me about her," she said then gently. He was quiet for a long moment. She was from County Cork originally. She had red hair and a laugh you could hear across 2 fields, a pause. "She died in '65, fever same as yours." "I'm sorry," Theresa said. She meant it without qualification. He nodded once, the same slow nod as before. "It was a long time ago." He put his hat on. "Good evening, Theresa." She watched him ride out across the darkening prairie, and thought about what it must be like to carry a thing for 13 years and still have it surface in the presence of fireflies and cottonwoods. August came in hot and relentless, the way August always did on the Kansas prairie, and Theresa worked through it with the kind of focused, physical determination that she'd found, in the year since Robert's death, was the only reliable anesthetic for grief. She planted a fall garden, salted and preserved everything she could, got her root cellar finished and stocked, and began the longer calculation of what the winter would require. She came into Caldwell regularly for supplies, and for the small, necessary reconnections with community that a person needs even when they are, by temperament, largely self-sufficient. She got to know Margaret Sims better, and the milliner whose name was Clara Hatch, and the preacher's wife, a sensible woman named Eleanor Briggs, who ran the town's small lending library out of the church vestry and had very strong opinions about the novels of Mr. Dickens. She also got to know Abel Sullivan better, in the incremental, accumulative way of 2 people who are in the same small town and keep finding themselves in each other's vicinity. They had the habit of meeting, usually on Tuesday mornings when she came in for supplies, at the coffee counter of Holt's store, where Holt made a surprisingly good pot of coffee and had the decency to make himself scarce once he'd served it. They talked easily, with the particular ease of people who have independently decided that the other person is worth being honest with. She told him things she hadn't told anyone else in Caldwell about Robert, about the Osage County farm, about the specific quality of the grief of losing someone you'd loved, but had perhaps already begun to lose in other ways before the fever took him. He listened with the full and serious attention he gave to everything important, and he did not offer comfort in the form of platitudes, which she was deeply grateful for. He did not, in those Tuesday morning conversations, tell her much about himself. He answered questions with economy, deflected the personal ones with a deftness that would have been imperceptible if she weren't paying attention, and kept the careful, practiced distance that she'd come to think of as the structural feature of his personality, the way a bridge has certain elements that are load-bearing and cannot be moved without the whole structure coming into question. But he was there. Every Tuesday, reliably, he was there. And when a dispute arose in September between Theresa and a neighboring rancher named Claude Briggs, no relation to the preacher's wife, and considerably less pleasant, over the exact boundary of her eastern fence line. It was Abel Sullivan who rode out, measured the land himself against the original survey, and told Briggs in terms that were courteous but entirely unambiguous that the fence was exactly where it was supposed to be, and that any further harassment of Mrs. Fletcher would be considered a legal matter. Briggs was not a man who liked being corrected, and he said several things about women homesteading alone that were ungenerous and inaccurate and said more about him than about her. Abel listened to all of it without expression and said, "Are you done?" And when Briggs had run through his remaining remarks, Abel said, "Good. The survey stakes will be reinstalled this afternoon. I'll be watching to make sure they stay where they're put." Theresa, who had been standing nearby observing all of this, said thank you afterward, and Abel said it was his job, and she said, "It may be your job, but the way you do it is a choice, and you choose to do it well." And he looked at her for a moment as if she'd said something that required more careful thinking than he had time for just then. He came back that afternoon with the survey stakes, as promised. She made coffee and brought it out to him while he worked, and they drank it standing at the fence line in the thin October sunshine, and she found herself looking at his hands where they wrapped around the tin cup-capable hands, scarred in a few places, careful and deliberate in their movements, and thinking about what it meant to be someone who did what he did every day in a place that required it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said, which was his standard response and which she had come to interpret as meaning yes, with the caveat that he might not answer. "Do you ever think about doing something else, something that isn't this?" She gestured vaguely, meaning the badge, the border town, the daily management of other people's worst impulses. He looked out at the prairie for a moment. "I think about a lot of things," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He turned the cup in his hands. "I had a piece of land picked out once, before I came here, down in the territory south of the Arkansas. It was good land. I thought about it sometimes when I was on the drives." He paused. "It's probably someone else's now." "What happened?" she asked. "The drive happened," he said. "After that I wasn't." He stopped. He pressed his lips together in a way she was coming to recognize as the gesture of a man pulling something back. "After that I wasn't in a place to think about land." She let it alone, because some things have to be approached the way you approach a spooked horse, sideways, slowly, without looking directly at them. But she thought about it. She thought about it a good deal. October became November and the world turned cold and gold and endless. The first hard frost came in mid-October, and she covered her garden and spent a week doing the work of deep winter preparation that could not be skipped. Her cabin was warm and solid, and the root cellar was full, and she had 4 chickens and the milk cow, and a solid sense of having built something out of her own hands and determination that was more satisfying than anything she'd known in a long time. She came into Caldwell on a Friday in early November for the last major supply run before winter properly settled in, and she ran into Abel at Holt's store, not on a Tuesday but on a Friday, which was unusual. And he looked different, not different in any visible way, but carrying something extra, some additional weight in the set of his jaw and the set of his shoulders that she recognized from the times when she had carried things that hadn't yet become speakable. "You look like a man who's had difficult news," she said, quietly, at the coffee counter, while Holt was occupied with another customer. He looked at her with the momentary surprise of someone who had not intended to be readable. "There's a man coming into town I used to know," he said. "He's been sending word ahead. He'll be here this week." She waited. "He was on the drive, the one I was telling you about." He stopped. "Then, he's the only other surviving member." "Is he a friend?" she asked carefully. "He was," Abel said. "Before." She didn't press. But she stayed in Caldwell that night. Margaret always had her room ready. And she was there on the Saturday morning when a lean, weathered man about Abel's age rode into town on a gray horse and stopped in front of the sheriff's office and sat there for a moment looking at the door as if deciding something. The man's name, she learned, was Cole Yarrow, and he had spent the 3 years since the drive going in the opposite direction from Abel, not settling in one place but moving continuously, carrying the same history in a way that had hollowed him out rather than steadied him. He had come to Caldwell, apparently, because he had nowhere else to go, and because Abel Sullivan was the only person left on earth who understood what he was carrying. She watched from across the street as Abel came out of the office and the two men stood facing each other for a long moment, and then Cole Yarrow said something in a low voice, and Abel took one step forward and put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder, and it was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen Abel Sullivan do. She went back to her errands and did not ask about it. But that evening, when Abel came to Margaret's for supper, he was changed. Lightened somehow, in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, as if some internal structure that had been under constant load had been briefly given relief. Cole was staying at the boarding house. Margaret had given him the room at the front. He came down to supper looking exhausted and a little wild around the eyes, the way men look who have been alone with themselves too long, and Margaret fed him roast chicken and apple preserves, and talked to him firmly about the importance of regular meals, in the way that she apparently talked to every person who came through her door looking like they needed someone to take a practical interest in them. After supper, Theresa and Abel sat on the boarding house porch while Cole had gone up to sleep, and the November night was cold and clear, and the stars over the Kansas prairie were so thick they looked like scattered flour. "I'm glad he came," Abel said. It was unprompted. "I can see that," she said. A pause. The night wind was cold and she had a wool shawl over her shoulders, and she could feel the warmth of him where they sat close together on the narrow porch bench, which they had not planned to sit on closely but which was the only seating available. "There are things I've never talked about," he said. "From the drive. Things I've kept very tightly." He stopped, started again differently. "When a man sees certain things, he starts to believe that the things he's seen have made him into a particular kind of person, not the kind who," another pause, "not the kind who can have ordinary things." She looked at him. "Ordinary things," she repeated. "A home. A life that isn't managed." He was speaking carefully, as if crossing ice and testing each word before his weight went down on it. People that he stopped entirely. She was very still. "I don't say this to be unkind," he said, and his voice was quieter now and more careful than she'd ever heard it. "I say it because I think you should know that I am aware of what I am aware that you and I have become important to each other in some way that I didn't plan for and don't know what to do with." She thought about what to say for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He looked at her. "And I think you're wrong about yourself," she said, gently but without apology. He was quiet. "You say you can't have ordinary things," she said, "but you've been riding out to my land to make sure I'm safe. You've been sitting with me every Tuesday morning. You've been memorizing what I say. Don't think I don't notice. You remember everything I tell you, every particular detail, the way people do when something matters to them more than they've admitted." She paused. "You told me about your mother and the cottonwoods without meaning to, and you've never taken it back." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before on his face, stripped of the careful management he usually maintained. "What I'm saying," she said quietly, "is that you already do love. You've been doing it this whole time. The way you do your job, the way you look after this town, the way you've been watching over me since I drove my wheel off in your street. You said you couldn't love anyone after what you'd seen." She paused, meeting his eyes steadily. "But you already do, and I think deep down you know it." He opened his mouth and then closed it. He was not a man who was often without words, but he was without them now. "You can keep arguing with me," she said, "but I'm afraid I'm in the right, and I suspect you're beginning to realize it." He was quiet for a long time. The stars were enormous overhead, and the November wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of town, making its low, continuous sound. Somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle, and the notes came and went on the wind, thin and sweet and slightly mournful, the way fiddle music always is when the night is cold. "I don't know how to be that for someone," he said finally. In the way that I don't know how to give someone something I'm not sure I have left to give. Abel, she said, and the simple directness of his name stopped him. You've been giving it every day for 3 months. You just haven't called it what it is. He stopped arguing. It wasn't dramatic, the stopping. He didn't reach for her hand or say something sweeping and conclusive. He simply went quiet, and in the quality of that quiet there was something new, as if a door had been open all along but had just now been acknowledged as a door. They sat there for a long while without saying much more, and the fiddle music drifted down from the saloon, and the stars moved infinitesimally in their ancient courses, and the Kansas night breathed cold and clean all around them. And Theresa Fletcher thought that this was the most honest moment she'd had in a very long time. Cole Yarrow stayed in Caldwell for 2 weeks. He and Abel had long conversations that Theresa was not part of and didn't try to be, because she understood that some things need to be worked through between the people who were in them, without the presence of anyone else. She could see, over those 2 weeks, the slow, painful process of 2 men helping each other put down something they had both been carrying alone for 3 years. It wasn't clean or simple. There were evenings when Abel came to Margaret's for supper, and was quieter than usual, further inside himself. The weight of whatever he and Cole had talked about pressing on him in ways that showed around his eyes and the set of his jaw. There were evenings when he seemed lighter, as if something had been named and in the naming had lost some of its power. She let him have all of it. She did not try to manage his process or hurry it or redirect it. She was simply there, which she had come to understand was often the most useful thing a person could be. Cole Yarrow left on a Wednesday morning in late November, heading south. He had, Abel told her that evening, decided to try something. A cousin in Texas who had land and needed help. A possibility, at least, rather than the continuous nowhere of motion. He looks different than when he came, Theresa said. He does, Abel agreed. And then, after a pause, so do I think. She looked at him. He was looking at the supper table, turning his coffee cup in his hands in the way he did when he was thinking carefully. Then he looked up at her. I would like to court you, he said, if you're willing. In the proper way, whatever that means in Caldwell, Kansas in November. She kept her face calm, though she was not calm. I think it probably means Sunday dinners and riding out to check on my fence line, she said. I've already been doing those things, he said, with a slight note of self-awareness. You have, she agreed, so it seems you've already begun. He smiled then. It was a full smile, not the half-committed beginning of one she'd seen before, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and less careful, and more like the man he might have been if the war and the drive and the years of necessary hardness had not done what they'd done. It was a very good smile, she thought. She planned to see it as often as possible. December in Caldwell was cold and occasionally brutal, with the kind of wind that comes off the plains with nothing to stop it for 400 miles and makes a person understand, viscerally, why the earth required so much from the people who chose to live on it. Theresa spent most of the month on her land, doing the particular work of winter, keeping the animals, maintaining the cabin's warmth, doing the mending and preserving and making that cold months allow when the growing is done. Abel rode out every Sunday. Without exception, through the worst cold spells and over frozen ground, that dark bay gelding came along the track from Caldwell in the late morning, and she always had dinner ready, not because she was performing the role of a woman preparing for a man, but because she genuinely wanted to share the meal. They ate and talked, and sometimes in the afternoons they walked the land in the winter cold, the prairie gray-gold and enormous around them, the sky so wide it required a person to either surrender to it or go mad, and she had long since chosen surrender. He told her things gradually over those Sundays, not in a rush, not with the performed intimacy of someone trying to seem open, but slowly, the way a fire comes up from coals when you have time and patience and good wood. He told her about growing up in Ohio, which was where they were both from, which made her laugh with the particular delight of unexpected coincidence. He told her about his father, who had been a carpenter, and about the years before the war when Ohio had seemed like the whole world. He told her once about the war, not the worst of it, but enough to understand the shape of what it had been, the exhaustion and the cold, and the way a young man of 18 comes back from something like that permanently different from the person who went in. He did not tell her about the cattle drive directly. Not yet. She didn't ask. She understood that it would come when he was ready and not before, and she was in no hurry, because she had begun to understand that what they were building between them was not a thing to be rushed, not a thing that benefited from pressure. It was a thing that needed time and air and the ordinary dailiness of two people learning each other's rhythms and textures, the way they took their coffee, the way they moved through the world on cold mornings, what made them quiet and what made them talk. She was falling in love with him. She was doing it the way she'd always done things, fully and without apology, but without announcing it before the time was right. She held it in herself and let it become real before she said anything about it, the way you let bread rise before you put it in the oven. Christmas in Caldwell was a thing Margaret Sims organized with the authority of a general and the warmth of a woman who understood that community is something that has to be actively made, especially in hard places. There was a church supper and a dance at the town hall, and the town dressed up as much as it could, which in Caldwell's case meant clean shirts and best dresses and lanterns strung across the main street in the cold December dark. Abel escorted her to the church supper and then to the dance, and the town of Caldwell watched with the overt interest of a small community that has been waiting for exactly this, and is pleased to see it happening. Margaret Sims watched from across the room with the satisfied expression of someone whose long-standing private assessment has been confirmed. Clara Hatch from the millinery shop smiled at Theresa over her punch glass with genuine delight. Abel did not dance, initially. He stood next to her watching with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who is deciding whether a thing is survivable. Then she put out her hand and said, "I won't step on your boots," and he looked at her hand for a moment and then took it. He was not a bad dancer. He was careful and precise about it, the way he was careful and precise about most things, and he held her at the correct respectful distance, and they moved through the music with the particular self-consciousness of two people who are very aware of being looked at. But after the first song the self-consciousness receded, and by the third song they were simply dancing, and the room had gone a little warm with all the people in it, and the fiddle music was quick and bright, and she was laughing at something he'd said, and he was smiling that full, face-opening smile, and she thought that she had made the right choice, driving her wagon west into this particular town. January was the hardest month. January in Kansas in 1879 was a month of blizzards and brutal cold, and the particular silence of a prairie under heavy snow, which is a silence unlike any other silence, absolute and clean and slightly terrifying if you are alone in it, and have not built your life to be strong enough to hold against the cold. Her cabin held. Her animals survived. She had built well and prepared well, and she weathered the worst of it with the methodical stubbornness that was, she was coming to think, the core of her character. She was not impractical. She was not fragile. She was deeply, fundamentally a person who did what needed doing when it needed doing, which was possibly the most useful trait a person could have in 1879 Kansas. Abel was in Caldwell through the worst of it, managing the town through the month when bad weather and bad tempers and bad whiskey combined in the way they always did in winter. There were fights, a fire at the edge of town that he helped put out in 15 below temperature, and a situation with a group of cattle drivers passing through that required several very long cold nights, and a confrontation that he handled without violence but not without considerable force of will. She heard about most of this secondhand. He told her some of it in that careful, partial way, when the worst of the blizzards broke in mid-January, and he rode out on a Tuesday because he couldn't get out on Sunday. He was tired in a way she hadn't seen him tired before, deeply, structurally tired, the kind that lives in the bones. She made him sit by the fire and she made him eat, and they sat there in the late afternoon light with the snow brilliant and blinding outside her southern window, and he talked more than he usually talked, the tiredness loosening something. He told her about the cattle drive then. Not everything, but the essential truth of it, that there had been 11 men, and that the violence had been sudden and terrible and had lasted less than an hour, and that in it he had done things that a man could not entirely forgive himself for even when they were done to save his own life, and that the 2 men who had not survived had been men he'd known well and cared for, and that carrying the fact of their deaths had sometimes felt like carrying an actual weight in his chest, something physical and immovable. He told her this looking at the fire, not at her, and she listened without moving, without making sounds of comfort or dismay, just listening with her full and complete attention. When he finished, there was silence except for the fire and the distant sound of the wind over the snow. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He looked at her then. "I thought it might change things," he said. "The knowing of it." She looked at him steadily. "It doesn't change what you are," she said. "It explains some of how you got there, which is different." He was quiet. "The things you did to survive, you were 27 years old and you were trying to stay alive," she said. "You're allowed to have done what you had to do. You're not required to carry it as a debt that can never be paid." "It doesn't feel that simple," he said. "I know it doesn't," she said. "I'm not saying it is simple. I'm saying that the man sitting in my cabin right now is a good man who has spent 3 years trying to pay a debt that doesn't require payment, and that I would like him to stop." She paused. "When he's ready." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely name. It had grief in it and gratitude and something else, something that was open in the way that things are open when they have been closed for a very long time, and the closing has become more painful than the opening. "I think," he said slowly, "that I might be ready." She reached across and took his hand. Just that, took his hand and held it, and he looked down at their hands together and then up at her, and his expression was the simplest and most unguarded she had ever seen on him. February came and went in a blur of cold and close quarters warmth, and the slow, steady accumulation of 2 people's lives beginning to lean toward each other. Abel came out every Sunday, and on some Tuesdays he came out instead of meeting at Holt's, and there were evenings when she came to Caldwell for one reason, and stayed for supper at Margaret's, and they sat on the porch in the cold afterward, bundled in their coats, and talked until it was too late for her to ride back and Margaret put her in her room. He asked her, one evening in late February, what she wanted. Not what her plans were for the land or her crops, but what she wanted for her life. She thought about it seriously and said, "I want to stay here. I want to work this land and watch it become something real. I want to be part of this community." She paused. "I want not to be alone in the particular way I've been alone since Robert died, which isn't about having company because I am very comfortable alone, but about having someone who knows you, who carries the knowledge of you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know you." She looked at him. "I know you take your coffee with 1 sugar, and you prefer the 2nd cup of the morning to the 1st, he said. "I know you talk to your cow when you're thinking through a problem, and you think no one notices. I know that the sound of the cottonwoods in the wind makes you stop what you're doing and just listen. I know you read your mother's Bible on Sunday mornings not because you're especially religious, but because it's the closest you can get to her voice. I know," he stopped. "I know a very great deal about you, Theresa Fletcher." She was looking at him and her throat was doing something inconvenient. "How long have you known all of that?" she asked. "Since approximately July," he said. She laughed, which broke the almost unbearable weight of the tenderness of the moment into something warmer and easier, and he was smiling that full smile again, and she thought she would have walked 100 miles in January cold for that smile. "Abel Sullivan," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, simply, directly, the way she did everything. He looked at her and the smile changed into something deeper and more serious, and he reached up and touched her face with the backs of his fingers in a gesture so gentle it was almost shy. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while, and then, I love you too. I have for a long time and I didn't know how to say it." "You just said it," she pointed out. "So I did," he said. He asked her to marry him in March, on a Sunday afternoon when the first real warmth of approaching spring was coming up from the south, and the prairie was just beginning to show its first tentative green. He did it simply, without elaborate ceremony, sitting on the fence rail at the eastern boundary of her land near the cottonwoods, because he was not a man given to elaborate ceremony. He said that he wanted to build something with her on this land and in this life, and that he was aware he was not an easy man in certain ways, and that the history he carried was not light, but that he intended to carry it better from here forward, and that he could not imagine the rest of his days without her in them. She said yes before he had entirely finished the sentence. They were married in early April, in Caldwell's small church, with Margaret Sims weeping openly and Eleanor Briggs playing the small church organ with considerable enthusiasm, and the Gunderson brothers standing in the back looking broadly pleased with themselves, as if they had somehow built this along with the cabin. Collero sent a letter from Texas that arrived the week before the wedding. He was well, he said. The land was good, and he was glad to hear of it. Abel read the letter twice and put it carefully in the inside pocket of his good jacket. The preacher, Reverend Briggs, was a small, dry man with a surprisingly warm voice, and he married them in 20 minutes on a bright April morning with the windows open and the spring smell of the Kansas prairie coming in on the wind. Abel Sullivan looked at her during the vows with an expression she planned to spend the rest of her life being the reason for. They moved on to her land together. It was her land. They had discussed this and he agreed entirely. It was hers and he was joining her on it. And the spring and summer of 1879 were the best she'd had in years and possibly the best of her life. They worked the land together, and she discovered what it was to have a partner not just in the romantic sense, but in the practical, daily, shoulder-to-shoulder sense of shared labor toward shared goals. He was, it turned out, an excellent farmer under the cattleman and lawman exterior, having grown up doing it in Ohio, and they complemented each other in the way that two people do when they have different strengths that happen to cover each other's gaps. He kept the sheriff's job through that first year, riding into Caldwell 4 days a week and home on the other 3, and she managed the homestead those days with the same capable independence she'd always had. But it was different now. Not lonely independence but chosen solitude, which is an entirely different animal. Their first argument was about the south fence, which he wanted to extend and she thought was unnecessary. And it was brief and slightly heated and resolved over breakfast the next morning with a compromise that she privately thought was more or less her original position rephrased. And she suspected he knew this, and had chosen to accept it with good grace, because that was the kind of man he was. Their second argument was about whether to get a second cow, which she was in favor of and he was lukewarm about, and this one was resolved when she simply got the second cow, whose name was Clara after the milliner, and he came home to find Clara installed in the small pasture next to the first cow and said, "You already decided, didn't you?" And she said, "I did consult with you about it," and he said, "You told me your position and then waited," and she said, "That's consulting," and he laughed and the argument was over. In October of 1879 she told him she was expecting a baby. She told him in the evening, at the supper table directly, because she was not a woman for elaborate constructions around important news. She had been almost certain for 2 weeks and entirely certain for 1. And she had spent that week thinking not about whether to tell him, but about how to manage the particular expansion of feeling that comes with the knowledge of a new life beginning, when you are a person who lost a husband and a mother and a farm, and have been, for some time, carefully not holding things too tightly. He was still for a moment after she told him, very still, in the way he went still when something hit him in a place that required the full attention of his whole self. Then he got up from the table and came around and knelt next to her chair and took both her hands and looked at her with an expression that was joy and terror and wonder in such equal parts that she felt her eyes fill with tears, which she almost never permitted, but this seemed like appropriate occasion. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you?" "I'm very well," she said. "I'm extremely well." He pressed his forehead to her hands for a moment, and she felt the slight tremor in him that was feeling too large for the container of a man who had kept himself contained for a very long time. "Abel," she said softly. He lifted his head. His eyes were wet, which she had not expected, and the sight of it made her heart do something it had not done for a long time, expand in that particular way to make room. "I didn't think I was going to have this," he said. His voice was rough. "Any of this." "I know," she said. "But you do." Their son was born in late June of 1880, in the cabin she had built with her own determination and the Gunderson brothers' strong arms, in the room with the window facing south toward the cottonwoods. The birth was attended by Margaret Sims, who had apparently delivered at least a dozen babies in her time, and managed the whole thing with the same practical authority she brought to running her boarding house, and by Eleanor Briggs, who held Theresa's hand and told her useful, factual information about the process in a way that was genuinely more helpful than anything more sentimental would have been. Abel paced the length of the cabin's porch for 4 hours. She could hear his boots on the boards, regular and relentless, and it made her smile between the harder moments that he was out there wearing a track in the wood. When it was over and Margaret came to the door and said, "Come in, Abel, and meet your son," he went through the door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has walked into something so far beyond the ordinary management of his heart that all the ordinary management has simply stopped. She was tired and flushed and had her hair down and was holding a very new and entirely opinionated person wrapped in a blanket she had made herself over the winter. And when Abel Sullivan looked at her and then at the baby she was holding, something crossed his face that she would never have words for. It was complete. It was total. It was the expression of a man who has been proved wrong about himself in the most profound and beautiful way possible. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful, absolute attention he gave to important things, and looked at his son's face with a kind of wondering seriousness that broke and remade her heart simultaneously. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. He thought about it. "James," he said. "For my father." "James Sullivan," she said, trying it. "James Abel Sullivan." He looked at her. "You don't have to, I want to," she said. They named their son James Abel Sullivan, and he was a large, loud, opinionated baby who made his feelings known with considerable vigor, and slept in the loft of the cabin under the window that caught the morning light and grew up hearing the sound of the cottonwoods. Abel took the spring and summer of 1880 as his last season wearing the sheriff's badge. He had planned to resign after the baby came, had been planning it since March, and when he sat down with the town council in August and told them he was stepping back to full-time farming, they received the news with the resigned respect of people who had been wondering when it was coming and were surprised it had taken this long. His deputy, a capable young man from Missouri named Harlan Fox, who had been Abel's right hand for 2 years and knew the town as well as anyone, took the badge, and Abel rode home for the last time in his official capacity on a Thursday evening in late August. And when he came through the door and set the badge on the kitchen table, Theresa looked at it and then at him and said nothing, because some moments are better without words. He picked it up again after a moment and put it in the box on the shelf where she kept the small things that mattered, the lock of her mother's hair and Robert's pocket watch and the letter from Cole Yarrow. And he turned around and she was standing in the kitchen with little James on her hip and the supper on the stove and the evening light through the south window laying gold across the cabin floor. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. The years that followed were the years that made up the substance of their life together, and they were good years, deeply and variously and sometimes hard and wonderfully good. The homestead grew. They broke more acres each year, planted wheat beginning in 1881, which was a risk and paid off in a way that justified the risk but only barely, and then paid off better in 1882 and consistently after that. They added a proper barn, a second cabin room, a winter kitchen, a chicken house that was considerably better engineered than strictly necessary because Abel, once he put his mind to something structural, built it to survive 100 years. Their second child was a boy as well, born in 1882, dark-haired like Abel and with Theresa's green eyes, a combination that resulted in a face of considerable future trouble for everyone who met him. They called him Patrick, after Abel's one uncle who had been, apparently, the family's best storyteller and worst decision-maker, and Patrick lived up to the name with enthusiasm from about age 2 onward. Their daughter came third, in 1884, and she was named Mary, after Theresa's mother, and she had the temperament of someone who has surveyed all available situations and found them wanting of sufficient organizational rigor, which she provided herself from approximately the moment she could talk. Caldwell changed around them in those years, as the wild edge of it softened incrementally with each passing season. The cattle trade shifted as the trails changed and the railroad extended its reach. The town built a proper school in 1881, and Theresa was on the committee that selected the school teacher, a task she took with the same seriousness she gave to all civic matters. She was, by the mid-1880s, one of the most respected voices in the community around Caldwell, known for her directness and her practical intelligence, and her reliable willingness to say the useful true thing when everyone else was still working up to it. Abel became, in the years after he put down the badge, the kind of man who is the bedrock of a place without being its public face. He helped his neighbors, the Weaver family 6 miles north, who had made it and were now expanding, 2 new homesteaders who arrived in 1882 and 1883 and needed the kind of knowledge that only comes from having been through several seasons, a young widower who came in 1884 with 3 children and no knowledge of farming whatsoever, whom Abel helped through the first winter with a patience that Theresa watched with deep and private admiration. He was also, without ever discussing it as such, a father in the specific way that only people who have doubted their own capacity for it can be, with a fullness of intention, an absolute and present engagement that made her understand, watching him with James and Patrick and little Mary, that all the years he had spent believing he was not capable of this had been a kind of preparation, a clearing out, so that when it came there was room for all of it. He taught James to ride on a July morning when James was 4 years old, putting him up on the patient gray mare that had replaced the borrowed horse from the livery, walking alongside him in the summer heat with a hand steady on the child's back and a calm, unhurried voice, and Theresa watched from the cabin door and thought about the man who had told her he couldn't love, and about the absolute foolishness of that claim in light of the evidence before her. There was an evening in the summer of 1885, when James was 5 and Patrick was 3 and Mary was barely 1, and Abel was sitting on the porch steps in the evening with James beside him, the two of them looking out at the prairie in that comfortable, companionable silence that she had watched develop between them over 5 years of their boy learning his father. She had come to the door to call them in for supper, and she stopped before they heard her, just watching. James said, "Papa, what's it like being a sheriff?" Abel considered this the way he considered things worth considering. "A lot of waiting and paying attention," he said. "And then occasional moments when you have to be very present." "Was it good?" James asked. A pause. "It was what I needed at the time," Abel said. "And then this was what I needed." He put his arm around his son's shoulders in that easy, natural way of a man who has long since stopped being careful about showing his affections. "This is better." Theresa went back into the kitchen and stood over her stew, and felt the particular fullness of a life that has been built from scratch and has turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be more than she had dared to ask for. Cole Yarrow came to visit in the fall of 1885, riding up from Texas on a fine November day with several days of road on him, and a wife beside him on a matching gray horse. A capable, sun-browned woman named Ruth who shook Theresa's hand in the direct way of someone who had been told good things, and was pleased to confirm them. He and Abel sat on the porch after supper and talked in the low, easy way of men who have come fully through something hard together and emerged on the other side of it. And Theresa sat with Ruth at the kitchen table and talked about Texas and Kansas, and the particular freedom and difficulty of building a life on the frontier. And James and Patrick showed Cole's horse to each other with the intensity of small people evaluating important things. Cole looked well more than well. He looked like a man who has put something down, which was the same thing she had seen Abel become over the years since she'd arrived in Caldwell. There was a steadiness to him now that hadn't been there when he'd ridden into town that November morning 3 years before. Before he and Ruth left the next morning, Cole took her hand and said, "He wrote to me in the spring, the first year. He said that he had met a woman who had driven her wagon wheel off in the main street and was the most ungovernable, sensible person he'd ever encountered, and that he was attempting not to think about it." She looked at him. He didn't. "He did," Cole said with a smile. "He used the word ungovernable. I kept the letter." She laughed, and behind her she could hear Abel making the sounds of a man who wishes he were somewhere else, and she turned around to find him looking at the sky with the studied neutrality of someone pretending not to have heard anything. "Ungovernable," she said. "It was meant as a compliment," he said, which she didn't entirely believe but chose to accept. By 1887, the Fletcher Sullivan homestead, as it was commonly known in the county, was one of the most established and productive quarter sections in the region. The wheat was consistent and the kitchen garden was legendary, and the milk operation, which had expanded from the original cow and Clara to a small but functioning dairy, supplied half the households within 5 miles. They had added to the cabin again, expanded it eastward, so it was now a real house with a proper parlor and 4 rooms, and a covered porch that ran the full length of the south-facing wall. And Theresa had planted a kitchen garden along the west wall that by summer was so full and various and fragrant that strangers asked to stop and look at it. James had started at the Caldwell school and was, his teacher reported, exceptionally good at mathematics and slightly too willing to explain this to everyone around him. Patrick was 4 and had recently acquired a philosophy of life that appeared to involve doing every interesting thing immediately and leaving the consequences for subsequent reflection. Mary, 3, had organized the chicken house into a system that the chickens found baffling and Theresa found impressive. There was a morning in April of 1887 that she thought about often afterward, because it was the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as significant but turns out, on reflection, to contain the essence of something. She woke before Abel, as she sometimes did, and went to the window and opened it to the spring air, and the cottonwoods were moving in the early morning wind with that particular sound like water, like something almost remembered, and the sky was that extraordinary prairie blue that only happens in the first hour after sunrise. The homestead was quiet and present around her, the barn and the garden and the fields beginning to green with the spring growth, and somewhere in the loft James was still sleeping, and she could hear, faintly, Patrick talking to himself in the easy monologue of 4-year-olds at rest. Abel came to stand behind her, putting his hands on her shoulders, and they stood together at the open window looking out at the land they had built their life on. "You hear them?" she asked. He knew she meant the cottonwoods. "Yes," he said. They stood there for a while in the spring morning, and the wind moved through the trees, and she leaned back against him, and felt the solid warmth of him, and thought about the woman who had driven into Caldwell 3 years and 9 months ago with a broken wheel and $40, and the vague general intention of building something. She had built something. It was this. It was the house and the land and the children sleeping overhead and the man at her back and the cottonwoods making their sound in the morning wind. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it simply, without leading, because she had always believed that the most important questions deserved simple asking. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man who doesn't know the answer, but the quiet of a man giving the question its proper weight. "Theresa," he said, and his voice was low and serious and full of the particular quality of a person who has found, after a long time of doubting it was possible, the exact thing they needed. "I did not think I would be able to say this and mean it entirely." A pause. "I am the happiest I have ever been." She turned around within the circle of his arms and looked at him in the early morning light, and he was looking at her with the directness and fullness that had replaced, over these years, the careful managed distance she'd first known in him. The storm-colored eyes were clear. The weight that had lived in his jaw and his shoulders for so long was gone, or nearly gone, replaced by something different, not the absence of the past but its integration, the way scar tissue eventually becomes simply part of the body. "Good," she said. He bent his head and kissed her, which was still, after 3 years of marriage, a thing she found she had no adequately composed response to, and she thought this was perfectly fine, and intended to keep finding it so for the rest of her life. James came downstairs wanting his breakfast and found them in the kitchen, which was the ordinary miracle of every morning, and Patrick came behind him in his nightshirt looking for adventure, and Mary called from her room until Abel went and got her, bringing her down on his hip still half asleep with her dark hair tangled, and her expression suggesting she had theories about the day that she would be sharing shortly. They ate breakfast in the April light, all 5 of them at the kitchen table, and the cottonwoods moved in the wind outside the window, and the Kansas prairie stretched away in every direction under the enormous irreducible sky. And Abel Sullivan, who had once told himself that he could not have this and could not be this, and had been carrying the proof of his wrongness in his arms every morning for 5 years, helped his son with his porridge and talked to his wife about the spring planting schedule, and listened to his daughter's theories about the chickens, and thought that the world, for all its difficulty and weight, had managed this particular morning extraordinarily well. The years continued to build on each other the way good years do, each one adding to the structure of the thing they had made. Abel taught James to ride properly and then to shoot, which he did with the same thoughtful emphasis on responsibility that he had brought to his years of keeping the law. The knowledge that a tool capable of harm required the complete attention of the person holding it. James was a serious-minded boy, increasingly, with his father's careful eyes and his mother's directness, and Abel watched his son grow with the continuous silent astonishment of a man who had not known he would have this and still, years later, had not entirely grown accustomed to the gift of it. Patrick remained committed to his philosophy of immediate interesting action, and there were several incidents in his early years that required paternal intervention at various levels of urgency. The time he climbed the barn roof to see if the view was better, the time he convinced James that a certain patch of the Bluff Creek had depth suitable for swimming in early May. It did not. The time he attempted to teach Mary's chickens to follow a particular path around the yard, using a system of corn trails that worked better than anyone expected, until Clara the cow disrupted the experiment by eating the corn. Mary, as she grew, became the particular kind of person who understands the practical structure of things at a level that makes the adults around them slightly uneasy. She was, by age 5, managing the chicken operation with a precision that produced more eggs than the family needed, and a waiting list among the neighboring homesteaders that her mother found both delightful and slightly alarming. She had her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and a temperament that combined the best and most demanding elements of both, and Caldwell would, in the years to come, find her an extremely useful and occasionally exhausting presence. Theresa continued to be a central voice in the community around Caldwell. She was on the school board from 1883 onward and was instrumental, in 1887, in the expansion of the school to accommodate the growing number of children in the district. She had, by this time, a practical acquaintance with the law governing women's property rights in Kansas, which had improved somewhat from the absolute baseline of the previous decade, but still left considerable room for improvement. And she said so, clearly, in the various forums where such things were discussed. She and Eleanor Briggs, the preacher's wife and library keeper, had become the kind of close friends who know the shape of each other's thinking and can hold a full conversation with partial sentences. And they had, between them, built the lending library from a vestry shelf to a proper room with 400 books, and a regular schedule of lending and a reading group on Wednesday afternoons that drew women from 5 miles in every direction and was, Theresa thought, one of the more quietly useful things happening in the county. Abel watched all of this with the combination of pride and amusement that characterized his regard for his wife. The pride entirely genuine and the amusement equally genuine, because she was, he had said once, on a slow evening on the porch, the most complete person he had ever met, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. In the spring of 1889, Theresa found she was expecting their 4th child, which she told Abel on a Sunday morning in March over coffee, and he set down his cup and looked at her with the smile, still the full, face-opening smile, still with the same effect after 9 years of knowing it, and said, "When?" "October," she said. "October is a good month," he said. Their 4th child was born on an evening in mid-October 1889, and was a daughter, a small, fierce, loud daughter who arrived in the world with the clear intention of making her presence known, and kept that intention permanently. They named her Catherine, and she had the red hair that Abel's mother had carried from County Cork, which made Abel sit very still for a moment when Theresa pointed it out, touching the faint copper curl on the baby's head with a kind of wondering tenderness. "Your mother's hair," Theresa said. "Yes," he said quietly, and then, she would have loved all of this. Theresa took his hand with her free one. "Tell her about it," she said. "I believe she already knows, but you can tell her." He looked at her in the lamplight with his youngest daughter in his arms and something in his face that was too large and too complete to have a single name, and said, "I love you, Theresa Sullivan, in case I've been remiss about saying so." "You haven't been," she said, "but say it anyway." He said it again. She believed him completely, which was possible because he meant it completely, and which was, she thought, the most fundamental good fortune of her life, not the land or the house or even the children, beautiful and beloved as they were, but this, that she had driven her broken wagon into Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1878 and found a man who was worth the patience it took to help him understand himself, and that he had been found. By 1890, the homestead that Theresa Fletcher had filed on for a fee, and a promise had become something that required the word established to describe it. Not grand, not elaborate, but deeply, solidly real in the way that things become when they have been worked and cared for, and built up from the ground by people who understood that worth is a thing you create through the dailiness of showing up. James was 10. Serious and mathematical and increasingly interested in the mechanisms of farming in the way that would eventually, though neither of his parents knew it yet, take him in the direction of agricultural science. Patrick was 8 and had lost none of his enthusiasm for immediate interesting action, but had gained a certain capacity for prior reflection that made Theresa suspect he would survive to adulthood after all. Mary was 6 and had already read more books than most adults in the county, and had views on all of them. Catherine was 1 and had red hair and a voice that could be heard at considerable distances, and a smile that was the exact replica of her father's. On a Sunday evening in the late summer of 1890, they sat on the south-facing porch as the sun went down over the Kansas prairie, the 4 children in various states of wind down around them, James reading at the far end of the porch, Patrick and Mary involved in some negotiation whose stakes were unclear but apparently significant, Catherine asleep on Abel's chest with her copper hair against his shirt. The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind with their sound of almost memory. Theresa looked out at her land, the fields going golden with the late season, the garden dense and green, the barn solid and permanent against the sky, the miles of prairie opening up in every direction under the great deep blue of the Kansas evening, and felt the particular fullness of a life that has been built exactly right, not without difficulty or loss, not without the weight of what comes before, but made whole by the willingness to keep going and the luck of finding. At a broken wagon wheel in a border town, the person worth building it with. Abel turned his head and looked at her, and she looked at him, and they did not need to say anything because they had been saying it for 12 years in every way that two people who know each other completely say the things that matter most. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on Catherine's back, and he turned his palm up and held her hand, and the cottonwoods kept on with their sound, and the prairie went gold and then rose, and then the deep violet of a Kansas evening in the last good summer of a century that had asked a great deal of the people who lived in it and given them, in return, this. The land, the sky, the children, the daily miracle of a love that had started with a broken wheel, and a man who had convinced himself he wasn't capable of it, and who had been, as Theresa Fletcher had told him on a cold November porch in 1878, entirely and beautifully wrong.